My husband sent me here. The laughter died the second those words left her mouth. A tiny, soaking wet 76-year-old woman standing in the doorway of the most dangerous biker bar in Montana, and she said it like she owned the place. Before anyone could speak, headlights swept across the windows. Black SUVs, moving fast. She turned and whispered, "They found me." Yeah, if you believe loyalty still exists in this world, stay until the end of this story. Subscribe to our channel, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The Iron Vultures didn't get many visitors on nights like that one. It was the kind of November cold that didn't just bite it, got down in your bones and stayed there. The kind of cold that made even the toughest men in Garfield County, Montana, pull their collars up and move a little faster between the parking lot and the door. The wind had been howling since sundown, pushing sheets of wet snow sideways across the highway, turning every road within 30 miles into a slow disaster. Most sensible people had been home for hours. The Iron Vultures weren't sensible people. That was part of the appeal. The bar had been running since 1987, founded by a group of Vietnam veterans who needed somewhere to drink without being looked at funny. Over the decades, it had evolved into something more complicated: a clubhouse, a courthouse, a confessional, a war room, depending on the night. The walls were covered in photographs, patches, memorial plaques, and hand-painted murals that told 35 years of stories nobody outside these walls would ever fully understand. It smelled like motor oil whiskey and something that might have been described as loyalty, if loyalty had a smell. On this particular Friday night, there were 22 men inside. And some of them were veterans. Most of them were. Former Marines, Army infantry, a couple of Navy men who never talked about what they'd done, a few younger guys who joined the club after coming back from Afghanistan or Iraq and finding that civilian life felt like wearing a suit 2 sizes too small. They'd all ended up here one way or another because the world outside didn't quite fit anymore, and the Iron Vultures was the one place that did. Mason Grave Turner sat at his usual table in the back left corner of the room facing the door the way he always did. He was 54 years old, 6'4", built like a man who had spent his entire adult life doing things that were either very physical or very violent, and usually both. His hair had gone mostly gray in the last 5 years, but his arms hadn't gotten any smaller, and the expression on his face at any given moment ranged somewhere between controlled anger and barely controlled anger. He had been the chapter president of the Iron Vultures for 11 years. Before that, he had been a Marine for 14. Before that, he had been a boy in rural Montana who watched his father come home from Vietnam and slowly disappear into a bottle and a silence that never broke. But Mason didn't smile much. He didn't need to. The room organized itself around him the way water organizes itself around a rock in a river, naturally, without discussion, without anyone needing to explain why. He was nursing his 3rd bourbon of the night, listening to 2 older members argue about whether a particular engine rebuild had been done correctly when the front door opened. MSA, the cold came in first, the way it always did, that sharp Montana November cold that made candles flicker and conversations pause. Then the snow, a small swirl of it crossing the threshold. Then the sound of wind. Then the laughter started. Because standing in the doorway was the last thing anyone in that room expected to see on a night like this, in a place like this. A small woman, old, maybe mid-70s, maybe older. It was hard to tell because she looked like she'd been through something brutal in the last several hours. She was maybe 5'2" on a good day, thin in the way people get thin when life has been working on them for a long time. Her coat was faded blue, the kind of coat that might have been nice 15 years ago. Her shoes were completely wrong for the weather, thin-soled leather flats that were soaked through, leaving wet footprints on the bar floor as she stepped inside. Her hair was blonde, going white, plastered down against her head from the snow. She was shaking. Not just from the cold, though it was clearly that too. She was shaking the way a person shakes when their body has been running on adrenaline for too long, and the bill is finally coming due. She held a worn leather handbag against her chest with both arms the way a person holds something they will not let go of. And she stood there in the doorway of the Iron Vultures biker bar, looking at 22 large, tattooed, leather-clad men who were now laughing at her, not cruelly, exactly more, the way people laugh when they see something that makes absolutely no sense, and she didn't flinch. Not even a little. "Lady, you need directions," called out a big man named Decker from somewhere near the bar. He was grinning. Several others were too. GPS sends you to the wrong address, Grandma, someone else offered. More laughter. She didn't answer. She wasn't looking at any of them. Her eyes were moving across the room with a kind of deliberate precision that was completely at odds with the way she was shaking, the way her wet shoes squeaked against the floor, the way she looked like a woman who had been running through a Montana snowstorm in shoes designed for church. She was scanning the room, looking for something, looking for someone. And then she found him. Her eyes landed on Mason Turner in the back corner, and she started walking toward him. The laughter began to thin out as people noticed this, because she didn't move like a confused old woman who'd wandered in out of the cold. She moved like someone who knew exactly where she was going and had been working toward this specific destination for a very long time. Mason watched her come. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched her cross the room with those wet shoes and that worn coat and that handbag held against her chest like it was the most important thing in the world. And something in the back of his mind, some old Marine instinct that had never fully shut off, went very quiet and very still. She reached his table. She was breathing hard. Up close, he could see she'd been crying, though the tears had long since dried. Her face was pale. Her lips had a bluish tinge from the cold. The hands holding the handbag had knuckles that were white from gripping. She looked him directly in the eye, and she said, "My husband sent me here." The remaining laughter stopped. But not because of the words exactly, because of the way she said them. There was nothing uncertain about it. No question, no wavering, no pleas or sorry for interrupting or, "I know this is strange." She said it the way a person states a fact they have been carrying for months, a fact that has cost them everything to deliver. Mason looked at her for a long moment. "Who's your husband?" "Arthur Hartwell." She set her handbag on the table and reached inside with hands that were shaking badly now. "He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should find Mason Turner in the Iron Vultures." She paused, searching through the bag. He said outlaws understand loyalty better than suits do." The room was very quiet now. "Lady," Mason said carefully, "I don't know any Arthur Hartwell." "You wouldn't remember him," she said. "You met him once, about 8 years ago, a veterans convoy in Billings. You were raising money for a family, a soldier's family. I don't remember their name, but Arthur donated and he helped organize the route, and you shook his hand and told him that if he ever needed anything. A lot of people have heard me say that." "He wrote it down," she said. "Arthur wrote everything down. That's who he was." Her voice broke slightly on the last sentence, just slightly, like something in her chest had shifted. She got it back almost immediately. "He kept notes on everything that mattered to him, and Mason Turner and the Iron Vultures were in those notes." She found what she was looking for inside the bag. She placed it on the table in front of Mason. "Mom, it was a coin. Military issue, old, worn, smooth at the edges from years of being handled. The kind of coin that gets passed between veterans that carries weight no civilian would fully understand." Mason's hand moved toward it before his brain fully caught up. He stopped himself, looked at it without touching it. "Where did you get this?" It wasn't a question. "Arthur gave it to me," she said. "He told me it had belonged to your father, that your father gave it to a man named Gerald Cotton at a reunion in 1994, and that Gerald Cotton gave it to Arthur because Arthur helped Gerald's son get into a treatment program, and that Arthur kept it for 20 years because he believed in what it represented." The muscle in Mason's jaw tightened. He still hadn't touched the coin. Nobody in the bar had moved. Because Mason Turner's father was not a topic that came up. Ever. Everyone in this room knew that. The man had been dead for 9 years, gone quietly and badly, the way men who carry too much from too long ago tend to go. Mason had never spoken about him publicly. The coin that his father had carried since 1968, was not something anyone outside of a very specific and very private chain of people should have known about. "Your name," Mason said. His voice had gone very flat. "Say it again." "Evelyn Hartwell." "And your husband?" Arthur James Hartwell. He died 14 months ago. The police said it was a heart attack. He was 68 years old and had no history of heart problems, and had a physical 3 months before he died, and his doctor told him he was in excellent health." She let that sit. "I think they killed him," she said, "and I think they've been trying to kill me since I found what he left behind." And that was the moment the headlights appeared in the windows. Yes, at the 3 sets of them, coming fast down the road, turning into the parking lot without slowing down that specific tight precision of vehicles moving in convoy formation. Not the meandering approach of a lost driver, not the casual pull-up of someone stopping for a drink. Tactical, coordinated. The kind of approach that people who've spent time in certain professions recognize immediately. At least 6 bikers were on their feet before the vehicles even stopped. Mason stood up slowly, which in some ways was more alarming. Mason Turner moving fast meant reaction. Mason Turner moving slow meant decision. Evelyn Hartwell turned toward the windows. Her face had gone even paler, which Mason would not have thought possible. "They found me," she whispered. "I thought I had more time. I thought—" She turned back to Mason. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how close they were." "Who are they?" Mason said. "I don't know all of them. Some of them work for a company called Vane Strategic Solutions. Some of them, I think some of them are federal. Or they used to be federal. The line is not clear." She was talking faster now, the words coming out pressed together. "Arthur's files explain it better than I can. I've read them 100 times, but I was a school teacher. Mr. Turner, I'm not a spy. I don't understand all of it, but I understand enough to know that these files cannot disappear and that these men cannot have them, and that Arthur spent the last 2 years of his life trying to make sure someone who could do something about it would get them. And he decided that someone was us. He decided the only people he trusted were people who had never lied to him." Her chin lifted slightly, not defiant exactly, something older than defiance. In 40 years of professional life, Arthur dealt with senators, generals, CEOs, federal agents, attorneys, and contractors. And in his experience, the Iron Vultures were the only group of men who did exactly what they said they would do and nothing else. She paused. He said that meant something. He said that in the world he'd been living in, that meant everything. Outside, the vehicles had stopped. No one had gotten out yet. Decker moved up beside Mason. He was a big man. Former Army, had ridden with the Vultures for 12 years. He said quietly, 3 SUVs, Montana plates, but they're rentals, you can tell by the clean. Can't see how many inside. Could be 10, said another voice. Could be more. Doors are not government doors, said a younger man named Trey, who had done 2 tours in Iraq and had developed a very specific eye for how federal agents moved versus how private contractors moved. The way they stopped, that's private. Contractors think they're special forces, but they move like they're getting paid by the hour. Mason looked down at the coin still sitting on the table. He looked at it for a moment that stretched out longer than it had any right to. Then he reached down and picked it up, turned it over once in his hand. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes did. He looked at Evelyn Hartwell. She was watching him the way a person watches something that their entire life has been narrowed down to. Not begging, not pleading, just watching with the exhausted clarity of someone who has run out of other options and has placed every remaining chip on a single number. "Sit down," Mason said. She blinked. "What? You're shaking so hard your teeth are about to go. Sit down." He pulled out the chair across from his. "Decker, get her something hot. Coffee. Whatever we have." He looked around the room at 21 men who were all watching him. "Nobody goes outside. Nobody opens that door until I say. Everyone stays calm, and we figure out what we're dealing with." He looked at Evelyn. "You're going to tell me everything. From the beginning. And I'm going to decide what happens next." "What about them?" she asked, glancing toward the windows. "They can wait in the snow," Mason said. "I don't negotiate in parking lots." Decker had appeared with a mug of coffee. He set it in front of Evelyn with a gentleness that was slightly incongruous given that he looked like he could bend a motorcycle frame with his hands. She wrapped both palms around the mug, and for just a moment, for just the briefest second, her composure cracked. Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together hard and got it back. "Thank you," she said quietly. Decker nodded once and stepped back. Mason sat down across from her. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at her and waited. Evelyn Hartwell took a breath, took a long sip of coffee, set the mug down, and she began. "Arthur spent 30 years as a federal contract accountant," she said. "You know what that means? Probably not much. Most people don't. It means he tracked money for government contractors. Billions of dollars moving through military logistics, supply chain operations, transport networks. It is the most boring work in the world. If you are not a person like Arthur, which is to say meticulous to the point of obsession and incapable of letting a number be wrong without finding out why. She paused. Something moved across her face, grief, but old grief worn smooth. In 3 years before he died, Arthur found a number that was wrong, then another one, then a pattern of them. Fake transport companies receiving real government payments. Ghost shipments documented and signed off on, but never physically existing. Shell corporations receiving funds that were supposed to be paying for military equipment and supplies that were, she stopped, that were ending up somewhere else. He didn't know where at first. He started tracking it the way Arthur tracked everything, quietly, carefully in notebooks, then in encrypted files, then in duplicate encrypted files hidden in different locations. Because by the time he had been doing this for 6 months, he had realized that the people responsible for this were not low level. This was not someone skimming petty cash from a supply budget. How big, Mason said. His best estimate by the end, and he was never certain, he was always careful to say he was never certain, was somewhere between $400 million and $1.2 billion. Moved over approximately 12 years. Through a network of contractors, logistics companies, and what Arthur called, she reached into the handbag again and removed a small notebook worn at the corners, a rubber band holding it shut, what Arthur called in his notes, and I'm quoting him here, a corruption architecture so integrated into legitimate defense contracting that separating it would be like performing surgery on someone's heart while they were still running a marathon. Several of the bikers who had drifted closer were now standing in a loose circle listening. Not crowding, just listening. He tried to report it, Evelyn continued, internally first. His direct supervisor at the contracting firm told him he was misreading the data. His supervisor's supervisor never returned his calls. He filed a formal complaint with the firm's compliance office and was told the complaint had been reviewed and found to have no merit. All of this happened within 30 days. Arthur said it was the fastest response to any administrative complaint he'd ever submitted in 30 years of work. He said that told him everything he needed to know about how deep the protection went. He went outside, Mason said. It wasn't a question. He tried. He contacted a journalist, a woman who wrote for a defense industry publication, had a reputation for serious investigative work. They met twice. She was careful and she was smart, and she told Arthur his documentation was genuinely alarming. 4 months after their second meeting, she died in a boating accident on Lake Michigan. She had grown up on that lake. She'd been sailing since she was 8 years old. The room was absolutely still. Arthur found a whistleblower's attorney. They spoke on the phone 3 times using a system the attorney set up specifically to be untraceable. The attorney was found dead of an apparent overdose in his office. He had been sober for 11 years. Evelyn's voice was steady. Steady in the way things get steady when they have been broken so many times they've reorganized into something harder. A former colleague of Arthur's, a man who had discovered some of the same irregularities independently and had been cooperating with a federal investigator, he disappeared. His car was found at a rest stop in Nevada. He was never found. And the federal investigator, Mason said, reassigned to a different department 8 days after the colleague disappeared. The investigation was closed. Insufficient evidence. Evelyn looked directly at Mason. Arthur kept track of all of them. Every person who came close to this and then had something happen to them. He kept files, dates, names, circumstances. He cross-referenced the deaths and disappearances with the payment schedules he'd documented with the corporate structures he'd mapped with the names that kept appearing across multiple shell companies and multiple suspicious events. She opened the notebook with hands that had steadied somewhat the coffee, the heat, the stillness of the room doing their work. 18 people, she said, across 8 years, journalists, auditors, attorneys, federal employees, and 3 veterans who Arthur believed had witnessed physical evidence of the fraud during supply chain operations at military installations. 18 people who got close, and then she closed the notebook. And then they were gone. Mason looked at her for a long moment. Your husband, he knew all of this, and he stayed. When he had 1 year left before retirement, he thought he was close. He thought if he could document it thoroughly enough, find the right person to give it to, it would be. She stopped, started again. Arthur was not a brave man in the physical sense. He would have been the first to tell you that. He was 5'9". He wore bifocals since he was 40. He gardened on weekends and he went to church and he couldn't change his own oil. But he believed genuinely deeply in the way that I think only people who have never been cynical are capable of believing. He believed that facts were powerful, that if the facts were right and the documentation was thorough, the truth would find a way to matter. Her voice broke on the last three words. She held it together. He was wrong about a lot of things, she said quietly, but I'm not sure he was wrong about that. From outside there came a sound, a car door, then another. Then the sound of footsteps in the snow, deliberate and unhurried, approaching the front door. And then a knock. Not a police knock, not the urgent hammering of law enforcement. A calm, measured three-beat knock, like someone who is used to having doors open for them and is simply waiting for the formality to catch up. The room didn't explode. It compressed. 21 men pulling in, slightly adjusting their weight hands, moving without anyone appearing to give an order. Mason didn't move. He kept his eyes on Evelyn. The files, he said. Where are they? Son, she patted the handbag. Some of them are here. The rest are Arthur hid them. I know where. I haven't retrieved them yet because I knew that once I moved them, they would know I had moved them and I needed to be somewhere. She glanced toward the door. Somewhere safe before I did that. The knock came again. Still calm, still patient. Mrs. Hartwell, Mason said. His voice was low. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it straight. Yes. Is everything you've just told me true? She looked at him. Her eyes were clear and exhausted and about 75 years old, and they had clearly seen enough of the world to understand exactly what the question was asking. On my husband's grave, she said. On everything Arthur was. Mason held her gaze for another 3 seconds. Then he stood up. He picked up the old military coin from the table and put it in his chest pocket. He looked at Decker. Don't open that door yet, he said. Let them knock. He looked at the rest of the room. 21 men looking back at him. Everybody stay exactly where you are, he said, and listen close because I'm only going to explain this once. The knock came a third time, still patient, still assured. And Mason Turner, president of the Iron Vulture's former Marine, a man who had not been surprised by anything in 15 years, turned to face the door and said nothing at all. Because he was thinking, because the coin in his chest pocket was warm from his hand and cold from his father's memory, and there was a 76-year-old woman sitting at his table who had walked through a Montana blizzard on wrong shoes carrying evidence of 18 murders and $1 billion in stolen money. And the men outside were still knocking. Like they were certain they would be let in. Like they had never once considered the possibility that they wouldn't be. That was, Mason thought, their first mistake. He walked toward the door. Mason reached the door and stopped. Oh, not because he was afraid. Mason Turner had not been afraid of a door in 30 years. He stopped because he was listening, and what he heard on the other side told him something important. No shouting, no commands, no badges being announced. Just that calm, patient knocking. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. The knock of a man who believed the door would open because doors always open for him. That kind of confidence wasn't law enforcement. Law enforcement announced itself. That kind of confidence was money. You call it money, Tano, or the kind of new money that had learned to move like old money. Mason put his hand on the door handle but didn't turn it. He looked back at the room. Evelyn was still at his table. She had both hands wrapped around the coffee mug, and she was watching him with those clear, exhausted eyes. She didn't look like she was about to run. She looked like a woman who had been running for 14 months and had finally decided she was done running. Decker was to Mason's left, 2 feet back. Trey on the right. 6 other men positioned across the room without anyone having said a word about positioning, just that old muscle memory, clicking in the kind that doesn't go away just because the uniform does. Mason opened the door. The man standing on the other side was not what he expected, and Mason had learned a long time ago to pay close attention to the things that weren't what he expected. He was maybe 50 medium height, was wearing a coat that cost more than most motorcycles in the parking lot. His hair was silver at the temples and perfectly managed. His face was smooth in the way faces get smooth when someone has both excellent genes and the money to help those genes along. He was smiling, not a nervous smile, not an apologetic smile, but the specific smile of a man in a meeting that he already knows the outcome of. Behind him, visible in the cold air, were 4 other men. Bigger, quieter. stationed at specific distances from each other, not standing around, standing in formation. "Mr. Turner," the man in the coat said, "my name is Richard Vane. I apologize for the hour. I wonder if we could speak for a few minutes." "You could have called," Mason said. "I don't have your number, and the matter is somewhat time-sensitive." His eyes moved past Mason into the bar, found Evelyn in about 1 second, and something shifted in that smile, not much, barely a millimeter, but it shifted. "I see she made it here. That's actually a relief. We've been very concerned about Mrs. Hartwell's well-being." "Have you?" She's been through an enormous amount of grief this past year. The loss of her husband it affected her deeply. More deeply than perhaps she's been able to communicate to the people around her. He paused. "May I come in?" "No," Mason said. The smile held. "I understand your caution. I want to assure you that I'm not here to cause any problems for your organization. I simply need to speak with Mrs. Hartwell and make sure she gets home safely. She's warm and she has coffee. She's fine. Mr. Turner?" The smile adjusted slightly, still there, but with a layer beneath it now, something harder. "Mrs. Hartwell has been making some very serious allegations about a number of people. Allegations that are, and I say this gently because I have genuine sympathy for what she's been through, not grounded in reality. Her husband's death was traumatic. She's been struggling. The documents she's carrying are things Arthur compiled during a period when, frankly, his own mental health was deteriorating. His colleagues were concerned about him in the months before his death." And from behind Mason, Evelyn's voice came clear and steady across the room. "Name one colleague who expressed that concern. In writing. With a date." Vane's eyes moved to her. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. His voice was gentle in the way the blade is gentle before it cuts. "Please, let's not do this here." "Name one," she said again. Arthur kept records of every professional interaction he had for 30 years. If anyone expressed concern about his mental health, he would have documented it. Name the person and the date. A brief silence. "This is exactly the kind of conversation we should be having in a more appropriate setting," Vane said. "She doesn't want a different setting," Mason said. "So that's the end of that." Vane looked at him. The smile was still technically there, but it had stopped meaning anything. "Mr. Turner, I want to be straightforward with you. I respect what your organization represents. Veterans, brotherhood, loyalty. Those are values I hold in high regard. I don't want this evening to go in a direction that creates complications for the Iron Vultures or for any of the men inside that bar." He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "I'm asking you as one man to another to let me speak with her privately for 10 minutes. After that, if she wants to stay, she stays. You have my word." "Your word," Mason said. "My word." Mason looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "The last person who offered me his word, while 4 armed men stood behind him, was a colonel in Fallujah who was skimming fuel allocations and threatening to have 3 of my guys transferred to a forward position with a known IED problem." He paused. "I didn't take his word either." He closed the door. The room held its breath for a moment. Then Decker exhaled slowly. "That man has done this before," he said. "The way he talks, that's not first time." "No," Mason agreed. He walked back toward his table, back toward Evelyn. "How much time do we have before they try something less polite?" "I don't know exactly," she said. "But Richard Vane doesn't come personally unless he's decided to end something. He has people for the early stages. When he shows up himself, it means he's done being patient." "What is he exactly?" "Officially CEO of Vane Strategic Solutions, a private defense and logistics consulting firm with government contracts in 11 states and 3 foreign countries. 40 years old as a corporation, very respectable. History, government relationships going back to the Reagan administration." She set the coffee mug down. "Unofficially, according to Arthur's files, the man who built and operated the financial architecture that has been draining federal defense contracts for 12 years. The money doesn't flow to Vane directly. Arthur said he was too careful for that. It flows through layers of companies and holding structures that Vane designed but doesn't officially control. By the time you trace it back to him, you're looking at 17 corporate layers in 5 countries. That's how he stayed clean. That's how he stayed clean." But Arthur was, she almost smiled. It was a complicated, almost smile grief and pride tangled together. Arthur was the kind of man who would spend 18 months untangling 17 corporate layers because the numbers didn't add up, and he could not let a number be wrong. He had the whole architecture mapped: names, account numbers, transaction dates, the political connections that provided cover, the law enforcement contacts who made problems disappear. She touched the handbag, all of it. And Vane knows what Arthur had. Vane knows what Arthur was working on. He doesn't know exactly how much Arthur was able to document before he died. That's why she stopped. That's why he needs to look at what's in this bag. He needs to know how exposed he is. Trey had moved up closer. He was 29 years old, the youngest senior member of the club, and he had a way of processing information quickly that Mason had always trusted. So the play isn't just to stop her from talking, he said. He needs to see what she has first. Yes, Evelyn said, which means he won't move hard until he figures out if there are copies. Arthur made copies, multiple copies, in multiple locations. She looked at Trey steadily. Vane doesn't know where they are, I do, and I haven't retrieved them yet, which means as long as she paused, as long as I'm available to answer questions, I'm more valuable to him alive than not. The word alive landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody flinched, but everyone heard it. Tell me about your husband, Mason said. She looked at him. It wasn't the question she expected. What do you want to know? Who he was, not the accountant, who he was. She was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday and no one remembered his. He made coffee every morning at 5:15 for 40 years, even on weekends, enough for 2 cups, each. Always had mine ready when I came downstairs. He read actual newspapers, physical newspapers every day until the day he died, said he needed to hold the thing to feel like the information was real. Her voice was soft. He coached Little League for 6 years, even though neither of our children played. He just liked kids and thought someone should do it. Nobody spoke. He was afraid of this, she continued. In the last year I could see it. He didn't tell me the details. He was protecting me, he thought. But I could see what it was doing to him. He couldn't sleep. He lost 15 pounds. He would sit at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. with those notebooks open, and I would come down and he would look at me with this expression. She stopped, gathered herself, like he was sorry for something he hadn't done yet. Did he know they were going to kill him? Mason said. Blunt, direct, the way he always went at the thing. Well, I think he suspected it was possible. I don't think he believed it would actually happen because Arthur fundamentally believed that the world worked the way it was supposed to work, which is an extraordinary thing to believe after everything he'd uncovered, but that's who he was. She folded her hands on the table. 2 weeks before he died, he sat me down and told me about the coin, about the iron vultures, about where he'd hidden the files. He told me that if anything happened to him, anything that seemed wrong, I should wait until I was sure I was being followed, and then I should come here. She paused. He said, Evelyn, I know it sounds crazy, but these men kept their word, and that is rarer than any amount of evidence. Mason was quiet for a moment. Around him, the room was still, not the stillness of discomfort, but of men paying attention to something that mattered. When did you know they were following you? He said. 3 weeks after Arthur died. A car that appeared in my neighborhood twice in 1 week. Different car the second time, same driver. I only noticed because Arthur had told me what to look for. She glanced toward the door. I went to the police. A detective came, looked serious, took a report. 2 days later, I got a call from a man who said he was Arthur's former supervisor at the contracting firm, calling to check in on me, very kind, very concerned. He mentioned casually that he'd heard I'd been having some trouble and asked if I was doing all right. She let that sit. He mentioned it before the police report could have been filed into any accessible system. Trey muttered something under his breath. I didn't say anything to anyone after that, Evelyn continued. I acted like a grieving widow who was fine. I went to church. I had friends over for dinner. I did everything Arthur told me to do. He said, look normal, act normal, let them believe you don't know anything. And then when you're ready, go. You drove here, Mason said. But I drove 4 hours with my headlights off for the last 30 miles, which Arthur specifically told me to do, because thermal imaging requires movement, and a slow car with no lights on a back road in a snowstorm is difficult to, she stopped. I'm sorry, he left me instructions. Very detailed instructions. That was Arthur. Something crossed her face, love sharp and aching. Even at the end, he was thinking about the details. From outside came the sound of an engine, then another. The SUVs were repositioning. Not leaving, repositioning. Decker moved to the window without being told. They're setting up a perimeter, he said quietly. East side, west side, one staying on the road. He paused. Professional spacing. How many men total? Mason said. My best count is 12, maybe 14. Armed. Without question. Mason looked at Evelyn. The file's in your bag. What exactly is in there? And she opened the handbag and began laying things on the table. Carefully, deliberately, like a person unpacking something fragile and irreplaceable. Photographs, printed spreadsheets with columns of numbers and handwritten margin notes in small, precise handwriting. Photocopies of what appeared to be corporate registration documents. A stack of pages that looked like they'd been printed from a database, names and dates and columns. A USB drive in a small plastic bag. And a sealed envelope with her name on it in the same small, precise handwriting. The photographs are from surveillance Arthur did personally, she said. He drove to 3 different states to document physical evidence, actual shipment yards, actual truck movements, actual meetings between Vane's people and government contracting officials. He was not a young man, and he had a bad knee, and he sat in a rented car for 11 hours on one occasion to get one photograph. She touched one of the photos without looking at it. The spreadsheets are his reconstruction of the financial architecture. The corporate documents are originals Arthur obtained through what he called creative use of public records requests. He filed hundreds of them over 2 years. The database pages are records he pulled during his legitimate audit work before he was removed from the account. When were you removed from the account? Mason said, then caught himself. When was he removed? 14 months before he died. They reassigned him, citing a restructuring. He had 3 weeks left on the contract. He kept working from his personal files. She touched the USB drive. This is encrypted. Arthur left me the key in a separate location which I have memorized. The drive contains everything that couldn't be physically documented, the full financial mapping, the names of the political figures involved, the specific transactions he believed funded what he described as procurement fraud with lethal enforcement. Lethal enforcement, Trey repeated. The people who died, Evelyn said. Arthur believed that Vane's organization had a division, people whose job it was to identify threats to the operation and eliminate them. Not always violently, sometimes careers, sometimes reputations, sometimes, she stopped, sometimes the other thing. The room was very quiet for a long moment. And then a younger member named Cole, who had barely said a word all night, spoke from across the room. He was 26, had been with the club for 2 years, had done 1 tour in Afghanistan as a supply chain specialist. He said, ma'am, the veterans he mentioned, the ones who witnessed physical evidence at military installations. Did your husband have names? Evelyn looked at him. Yes. Can I see the list? She looked at Mason. Mason gave the smallest nod. She found the right page in the stack of documents and held it across the room. Cole crossed the distance in 4 strides. He took the page. He looked at it for several seconds, and his face did something complicated. The kind of complicated that happens when information confirms something a person already feared, but had been holding at a distance. This name, he said. He pointed to a line on the page. Marcus Webb, Army Supply Corps, killed in a vehicle accident outside Fort Bliss, Texas 2 years ago. Yes, Evelyn said. I knew him, Cole said. His voice was controlled in the way voices get controlled, when control is the only thing standing between a person and something they can't afford to let out in this room at this moment. We were in the same unit. He called me 3 months before he died. Told me he'd seen something in a shipment manifest that didn't match the physical inventory. He was going to report it. He looked at the page. I told him to be careful. He said he would be. He set the page back on the table. The accident report said he ran a red light at 2 in the morning. Marcus Webb didn't run red lights. He was the most cautious driver I ever knew. Checked his mirrors every 30 seconds, wore his seatbelt in parking lots. Nobody said anything. Then Decker said very quietly, "How many guys in this room got a call like that? From somebody who saw something and then something happened to them?" He looked around. "Be honest." A silence. Then a hand went up. Then another. Then a third man spoke up without raising his hand. Then two more. By the time it was done, 7 men in the room had either received a call from someone who died under questionable circumstances after witnessing a supply chain irregularity or knew someone who had. Evelyn watched this. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Wilson watched it too. His expression had not changed. His expression almost never changed. But the quality of his stillness had shifted into something different, something that anyone who knew him well would have recognized as the specific stillness that came over him when he had made a decision he wasn't going to unmake. He picked up the USB drive, looked at it. "The people who could actually do something with this," he said. "Journalists, investigators, people with subpoena power. Your husband had contacts." "He had a list," Evelyn said. "People he believed were genuinely honest, not many. He vetted them for 2 years. Journalists who had broken serious stories without flinching. Federal investigators and offices he believed were not compromised. An attorney who had successfully prosecuted a major defense contractor case 10 years ago and had spent the decade since being systematically ignored by the industry." She paused. "Arthur said the problem was never finding honest people. The problem was getting the information to them before Vane's organization identified them and closed the channel." "How did he plan to do it?" "Volume and velocity," she said. "His plan was to release everything simultaneously to every contact on the list through multiple channels in a single window of a few hours. He said that if the information moved fast enough and wide enough, even Vane's resources couldn't contain it. You can stop one journalist. You cannot stop 47 journalists in 12 states receiving the same documentation in the same hour." "He never got to do it," Mason said. "He died before he could set it up." She looked at the sealed envelope with her name on it. "But he left instructions. You haven't opened that." "I was saving it." She stopped. "I know that sounds strange, but Arthur said to open it when I was safe, when I knew I was in the right place." She looked around at the room, at the men who had moved from laughing at her to listening to her without her asking them to. "I think this might be the right place." "Open it," Mason said. Her hands were not completely steady as she broke the seal. The envelope was not thick, just a few pages folded together. She unfolded them, and her breath caught slightly, the way breath catches when you hear a voice you thought was gone. She read in silence for a moment. Her face moved through several things. Then she read aloud, and her voice held. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, you made it. I knew you would. You have always been tougher than you give yourself credit for, and I say this as a man who has spent 43 years being impressed by you daily." Several bikers looked at the floor, or the ceiling, or somewhere sideways. "And what I need you to do now is simple. Give the drive to the people who are protecting you and tell them that the key is the date we first danced. They'll know what to do with the technical side. The contact list is on the drive in a folder called Arthur's Garden. I know, but you said I needed a hobby. Every name has a note beside it explaining why I trust them. Tell whoever is helping you to send to all of them at once. Don't stagger it. All at once and as fast as possible." She paused, then continued. "I am sorry I couldn't do this myself. I am sorry I left you in a situation no husband should leave his wife in. But I believe in the people I'm sending you to, even though I never formally met most of them. I believe in them because Arthur Hartwell spent 30 years watching powerful men fail every test of character available to them, and then he spent one afternoon at a veterans charity convoy watching a group of bikers keep every promise they made to a family they'd never met, and he thought there are the people." She folded the pages, pressed them once flat on the table. She didn't look up for a moment. When she did, her eyes were bright, but her chin was level. "He said other things," she said. "Personal things. I'll keep those." "Fair enough," Mason said. Now he picked up the USB drive again. He looked at Decker. "Get Russo on the phone." Russo was a former signals intelligence specialist who now ran an independent cybersecurity firm in Bozeman. "Tell him we have an encrypted drive and we need it processed tonight." He looked at Trey. "Wake up everybody who's within 2 hours of here. I want more people inside before those SUVs decide patience is overrated." He looked at Cole. You know any journalists? Cole blinked. What? Journalists, reporters, people who write things down and publish them. My cousin's girlfriend works at a paper in Denver. How serious a paper? Pretty serious. Regional, but pretty serious. Call her. Tell her you have something. Don't say what yet. He stood. He looked around the room. He said the next words quietly, not loudly, the way important things get said when they're real. Vane is outside with 12 men because he thinks we're 12 bikers in a bar on a Friday night. He thinks the snow and the road and the hour are working for him. He paused. He doesn't know what's in this bag. He doesn't know what we know. And he doesn't know that this woman's husband spent 2 years building something that was designed to move faster than anyone could stop it. He looked at Evelyn. You said your husband believed facts were powerful. Yes. Tonight we find out if he was right. She looked at him steadily. Then from outside came a sound that changed the temperature of the room instantly, the brittle crack of something hard against the back door. Not a knock, not a request, a test. And Mason Turner turned toward it with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for the other side to make the first mistake. The sound came again, harder this time. Not a knock, not a warning. The specific sound of something metal being tested against the doorframe, someone checking how solid the back entry was, the way a person checks a wall before they decide whether to go through it or around it. Professional, patient, methodical. Mason was already moving. Decker, back door, 2 men, nobody gets through. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice when things got serious. Volume was for people who needed to convince themselves they were in charge. Trey, kill the exterior lights on the east side, not the west. I want them thinking we don't know they're back there yet. He looked at Cole. You call your cousin's girlfriend yet? Calling now, Cole said, stepping away with his phone. Wake up everybody within 2 hours, Mason said to a man named Birch, who was 51 years old, former Army logistics, and had the particular skill of being able to contact 60 people in 20 minutes when the situation required it. I don't care what they're doing. I don't care what time it is. Tell them we have a situation at the bar and I need bodies. Birch was already dialing before Mason finished the sentence. Mason turned back to Evelyn. She had not moved from the table. She had gathered Arthur's papers back into organized stacks with the focused calm of a woman sorting student papers before a lesson, deliberate, unhurried, as though the sound at the back door was an inconvenience rather than a threat. Mason had seen combat veterans with worse composure in lesser situations. He noted this without saying anything about it and sat back down across from her. The key, he said, for the drive, the date you first danced. June 14th, 1974. She said it immediately without hesitation, the way dates like that live in a person, not in memory, exactly deeper than memory. A church social in Billings. Arthur stepped on my feet twice and apologized 7 times for each step. I told him the apologies were worse than the stepping. Something moved across her face. He was a good dancer by the end. It took him about a decade, but he got there. Mason took out his phone and typed the date in a note, then forwarded it to Russo's number. Russo had picked up on the second ring when Decker called and was already on his way. Former signals intelligence didn't fully retire. It just found new applications. The contact list, Mason said, Arthur said 47 names, 47 verified contacts. She stopped, then continued more steadily. He spent the last 8 months of his life building that list. Every person on it he researched independently. Looked at their published work, their professional history, any cases or stories they'd been involved in that might indicate how they responded when the pressure came. He eliminated anyone who had ever, in his opinion, backed down from something they should have stood behind. She paused. He said the final list was the loneliest document he'd ever compiled. 47 honest people in the entire professional apparatus of American media and federal law enforcement. 47 is enough, Mason said. Another sound from the back of the building, louder. Decker's voice low and flat. They're not testing anymore. They're measuring. Mason stood, looked around the room, counted. 14 men currently inside, 3 more who'd been in the back and had filtered forward when the sound started. Russo was 40 minutes out. Birch had reached 8 people so far who were moving. The weather was working against reinforcements as much as it was working against Vane's people outside, which meant for the next hour this room was what it was. 14 men, one old woman, and a USB drive that had gotten 18 people killed. Mrs. Hartwell, Mason said, I need you to move to the back office, away from the windows. I'd rather stay here. I'd rather you stayed here too, he said. That's why you're going to the back office, Amon. He looked at her directly. I can't watch the door and watch you at the same time, and right now watching the door is what I need to be doing. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she gathered Arthur's pikers, put them back in the handbag, picked up her coffee mug, and stood. There's one more thing you should know before I go, she said. Tell me fast. In the photographs, there's one you haven't looked at yet, third from the bottom of the stack on your left. She nodded toward the table. Arthur marked the back of it with a red dot. He said it was the most important one. He said, she stopped. He said when the right person saw it, they would understand why this could never stay quiet. Well, she walked toward the back office. A younger prospect named Jamie, 19 years old, wide-eyed, doing everything right without being told, fell in beside her without being asked. Mason watched them go, then turned to the table and reached for the photographs. He counted from the bottom. Third one. He turned it over. On the back, a small red dot, just as she'd said, exactly the size of a pen tip. Arthur Hartwell, careful to the end. Mason turned it face up. And the photograph showed a loading yard, industrial large scale, the kind of facility that processed military equipment in significant volume. There were trucks. There were crates. There were men in contractor vests moving between them. Taken from distance with a good lens, clear enough to read faces, clear enough to read the partial text on one of the shipping containers in the background. And standing to the left of the nearest truck in a group of 3 men was a face that Mason recognized. He went very still. The face was younger in the photograph than it was now. Mason calculated this was taken roughly 2 years back, but it was unmistakable. The jawline, the way the man stood weight slightly forward on the balls of his feet, the particular physical posture of someone who spent their life on a motorcycle and had never quite learned to stand differently. His name was Caleb Marsh. He had been one of the Iron Vulture's most beloved members, 28 years old when he died. Funny in the way truly good people are funny, not performing it, just naturally, genuinely finding things to laugh at that made the people around him laugh too. Mason had recruited him personally after meeting him at a veterans job fair in Missoula. Caleb had been struggling, 2 tours in Afghanistan Supply Corps, came back with no plan and too much time, and that specific hollow-eyed look that Mason recognized from his own mirror 15 years earlier. Mason had brought him in, given him work, given him the club, and watched him turn into something. Watched him become the kind of man his own unit couldn't make him into. Caleb had died 14 months ago. His motorcycle went off a highway outside Tucson. The road was dry. The weather was clear. Caleb had been riding for 6 years and had never had an accident, not even a minor one. The accident report noted a possible mechanical failure but could not confirm it. Mason had buried him, had spoken at the service, had put his hand on Caleb's mother's shoulder and told her that her son was the finest young man he'd known in years and meant every word of it. Mason was still looking at the photograph when Trey appeared at his shoulder. Trey looked at the photo, a pause. Is that? Yes. What's he doing in a supply yard in Arizona 2 months before Trey stopped? 6 months before, Mason said. His voice was absolutely level. Arthur's notes. Where are Arthur's notes? He was already turning through the papers on the table, not frantically, but with a precision that matched the way he felt right now. Not falling apart, not close to falling apart, but reorganized around something so significant that everything peripheral had simply stopped mattering. He found the page, the handwritten notes that corresponded to each photograph. He found the notation for the red dot photograph. Arthur's handwriting was small and exact, and Mason read it in under 30 seconds, and then read it again because the first time his brain rejected what his eyes were telling him. The notation read, subject identified as C. Marsh member, Iron Vulture's MC Montana chapter. Presence at Facility 7 suggests witness to Phase 3 transport operations, illegal weapons components moving through Vane's strategic logistics network. Marsh was apparently cooperating with internal inquiry or conducting personal investigation. Unable to determine which. Cross-reference Marsh death T, vehicle accident, Tucson AZ 8 months after this photograph. Investigating Officer Deputy R. Solano P. McCowney. Solano appears on separate payment lists, see page 31. Mason set the paper down. He put both hands flat on the table, and he stood there with his hands flat on the table for a moment that stretched out past what a moment is supposed to be. Around him, the room continued its work. Men on phones, men at windows, the distant sounds of Vane's people repositioning outside, the normal operating sounds of a building under quiet siege. All of it continued, and none of it reached Mason right now, because he was standing in the specific silence of understanding something that cannot be understood and then undone. They had killed Caleb. Not an accident, not a mechanical failure on a dry road on a clear night. A 28-year-old kid who had survived 2 combat tours in Afghanistan and come home and built himself a life and had seen something he wasn't supposed to see in a supply yard in Arizona, and they had put him on a highway outside Tucson, and they had made it look like bad luck. And Mason Turner had put his hand on that boy's mother's shoulder and said he was the finest young man he'd known in years. Mason, Trey's voice was quiet. He had read the notation too. Mason, look at me. Mason looked at him. We knew him, Trey said. Caleb was ours, and they... He stopped, ran a hand across his face. How did they know to target him specifically? How did Vane's people even know Caleb had been to that yard? Because someone told them, Mason said. His voice had gone to the flat, factless tone it sometimes got when the alternative was something he wasn't going to allow himself right now. Someone identified him, which means there's a name on one of Arthur's lists that connects to this club. The words landed in the room. The men who had drifted close enough to hear went very quiet, because the Iron Vultures had been compromised before. Years ago, briefly, a situation that had been found and excised and never discussed again. The possibility was not theoretical, and the thought of it now tonight with Vane's people outside and Arthur's drive on the table, and Caleb's face in a photograph in Mason's hand, the thought of it was almost worse than the men outside. Almost. Nobody talks about the photograph outside this room, Mason said. Not loud, not harsh, just the words placed where they needed to be. Nobody mentions Caleb's name to anyone until I know more. We move on what we can confirm. He looked at Trey. Get the notes on page 31. Now, Trey found page 31. The payment list. 32 names across multiple categories, law enforcement contacts, government officials, 2 judges, 1 state senator, in a section labeled simply organizational assets. 4 names in that section. Mason scanned them. 3 were unrecognizable. The 4th was not. Trey read it at the same time Mason did. They looked at each other. Well, the name was a man named Gary Pruitt. Gary Pruitt had been a member of the Iron Vultures for 4 years. Not a senior member, not someone in Mason's inner circle, but a member, someone who knew schedules, knew faces, knew who went where and why, someone who would have known that Caleb had mentioned a supply yard trip to some of the other members the week before he rode to Arizona. Gary Pruitt had left the club 8 months ago. Mason had accepted his departure without question. Men left clubs, it happened. Gary had said he was relocating to California for work. Mason had shaken his hand and wished him well and thought nothing more about it. He was a plant, Trey said quietly. He was an asset, Mason said. We hasn't him. Planted it or returned, I don't know. Doesn't matter right now. He looked at page 31 again. This means Arthur knew there was a connection between Vane's organization and this club, which means Arthur knew the risk he was taking sending Evelyn here. He sent her anyway. He sent her anyway. Mason was quiet for a moment. He believed in us more than he was afraid of the risk. He set the paper down. Caleb trusted us with his life, and we didn't know he needed us to. Almer trusted us with his wife's life, knowing exactly what he was asking. He looked at the room. That is what's happening tonight. That is what this is. Nobody spoke. But this quality of the silence shifted from the operational silence of men at work to something older and heavier and more decided. Then from the back of the building came a shout. Decker's voice, sharp and clear. They're breaching the back door. 2 men with a ram. Move. Otto, the room shifted instantly. Not chaos, the opposite of case. Men moving to specific positions with the efficiency of people who have trained for things like this, even when they haven't technically trained for this exact thing. Mason moved toward the back and almost collided with Jamie, the young prospect, coming the other direction fast. "She won't stay in the office," Jamie said. He looked genuinely helpless, which under other circumstances might have been funny. "She never was going to," Mason said and turned. Evelyn was right behind Jamie. She had the handbag over her shoulder, and she was carrying a fire extinguisher she had apparently removed from the wall bracket in the back hallway, holding it in both arms like she planned to use it. Mason looked at the extinguisher. "Mrs. Hartwell, I was a public school teacher for 31 years, she said, not breaking stride. "I have broken up more fights than you have had hot meals, and I am not sitting in a back office listening to it." She looked at him steadily. "Where do you need me?" Mason almost said something, decided against it. "Stay behind Decker. Do not go near the door." "Agreed." She looked at the fire extinguisher in her hands. "This will also work on a person if needed." "I know it will. That's not the problem." He turned back toward the rear of the building. The back door held. Barely. The ram hit it 3 times before Decker, 6'3", 250 pounds of former Army infantry, braced himself against it from the inside, and the door held on the 3rd strike. The 4th strike never came because, from outside, there was a sharp exchange of voices and then the sound of the men pulling back. Silence. Then Vane's voice amplified. Now he had a bullhorn, which told Mason they'd come prepared for a long engagement, which told Mason this was not improvised. "Mr. Turner, I'd like to avoid any further escalation. I understand you've seen some of what Mrs. Hartwell brought with her tonight. I want you to know that I am prepared to have a very honest conversation about what that material actually represents and what the context is that you're missing." "He's stalling," Trey said. "I know," Mason said, "waiting for the sheriffs to arrive and make it legal." "I know." Mason pulled out his phone and called Russo again. "Where are you?" 22 minutes, Russo said. "I'm moving as fast as I can in this weather. What are you dealing with?" "Encrypted drive 47 targets need simultaneous distribution through secure channels." A pause. "That's not 22 minutes of work, Mason, that's..." "I know what it is. How long?" "Once I have the drive and the key, if the encryption is what I think it is, 4 hours a minimum to crack it, verify integrities, set up distribution." "We don't have 4 hours." Mason looked at the door. "Assume the contents are what they say they are. Can you set up the distribution architecture without opening the drive first?" Or another pause. Longer this time. The sound of Russo thinking. "I can pre-stage everything, set up the simultaneous send protocol load, the contact list the moment the drive opens. So the second we have access, we push. No delay." "That's what I need. 22 minutes. 19 now," Russo said. "I'm running lights." Mason ended the call. He looked at the assembled room. He looked at Evelyn standing with a fire extinguisher and a worn leather handbag watching him. He said, "There's something else you need to know." He picked up the photograph of Caleb. He walked it across the room to where she was standing and held it up. "You know who this is?" She looked at it. "That's the photograph with the red dot. Arthur circled that face specifically in his notes. Said he was..." She stopped. Her eyes moved from the photograph to Mason's face. She read something there. "You know him." "He was one of ours," Mason said. "He was 28 years old and he was one of the best men this club ever had. He died 14 months ago in a motorcycle accident in Arizona." He watched her process this. Arthur connected his death to Vane's operation. He was at that yard. He saw something. And Evelyn's face moved through several things. Grief came first, the specific grief of someone who already carries so much of it. That new grief has a familiar shape. Then something that might have been guilt, or the ghost of guilt. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know he was Arthur. Never told me the name connected to a specific club. He kept his notes in sections that didn't overlap. I think he was protecting me from knowing too much." "He was protecting you," Mason said. "But I need you to know this, because it means tonight is not just about Arthur's evidence. Tonight is about Caleb too. Tonight is about Marcus Webb and the 18 people on that list and every veteran in this room who got a phone call from someone who saw something and then disappeared." He paused. "When Russo gets here and we push that drive, it goes out for all of them, not just for Arthur. For all of them." She looked at him for a long moment. "Arthur would have wanted that," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiness of someone who has decided something and doesn't need to revisit the decision. He spent 2 years building that list, and he spent 2 years carrying the weight of every name on it. He would have wanted, by Helen, she stopped. He would have wanted it to matter for all of them. When, from outside, Vane's voice again on the bullhorn, still calm, still patient. Mr. Turner, I have 3 county sheriffs en route to this location. This does not need to become a confrontation with law enforcement. Let's resolve this between reasonable people before that becomes necessary. Mason looked at the door. He looked at the USB drive on the table. He looked at 18 minutes on the clock. And then a sound that nobody expected, a young man's voice, tight and controlled, from near the east window. Cole. He had his phone pressed to his ear, and his face had gone the particular color of someone receiving information that is simultaneously terrible and clarifying. He lowered the phone slowly. He turned. That was my cousin's girlfriend, he said, the journalist in Denver. He paused. She says she's been trying to reach her editor for the last 20 minutes. Her editor is not answering. Her editor's personal cell is not answering. He paused again. Her editor broke a story about Vane's strategic solutions 18 months ago, a story that was subsequently retracted. Her editor's name is on Arthur's contact list. The room went very still. Cole said, she says her editor has a teenage daughter who takes a school bus at 7 a.m. The words fell into the silence of the room, and nobody said anything for a long moment because there was nothing to say that would make those words smaller than they were. Then Mason picked up the USB drive. He held it in his closed fist for a moment. He looked at the door. He looked at the clock. He looked at Evelyn. 17 minutes. Russo, he said, calling back without waiting for a greeting. Change of plan. Can you walk someone through the pre-stage setup by phone right now? Depends on who, Russo said. Mason looked at Cole. How good are you with a laptop? Better than most, Cole said, already moving. Better than most, Mason said into the phone. A pause, then Russo said, tell him to open a browser. Cole was already sitting down at the bar's ancient laptop, the one they used for music and occasionally for looking up parts. He opened the browser. He looked at Mason. Mason nodded. Cole said into Mason's phone, I'm in. Tell me what to do. And 17 minutes began to move. The bullhorn outside had gone quiet, which was not a relief. In Mason's experience, the moment a man like Vane stopped talking was the moment he'd finished being patient. Decker appeared from the back hallway. He was holding his arm at an angle that suggested something had happened to it during the door bracing. He didn't mention it, and Mason didn't ask. 2 men still on the back, Decker said. They've repositioned, but they haven't left. East side has 3, west side has 2. Road position is holding. How are you on ammo? Mason said quietly. Fine, Decker said. But if it gets to ammo, it's already gone wrong. It's not going to get to ammo, Mason said. It's not going to get to ammo because we're not going to give Vane a law enforcement call he can use. The moment a shot gets fired, this becomes his narrative, and we lose everything Arthur spent 2 years building. So what do? We outlast him, Mason said. 14 minutes. Decker looked at the clock, looked at Cole at the laptop, looked at the USB drive in Mason's hand. And if the sheriffs arrive before Russo does, then we let them in, Mason said. We're not breaking any laws. Evelyn Hartwell is a citizen who came to us for help, and we're giving it to her. The evidence she brought is legally hers. The distribution of that evidence to journalists and federal investigators is protected activity. He paused. Vane cannot arrest her. He can only stop her if the information doesn't move. So the information is going to move. 13 minutes. Cole said, I've got the protocol set up. Russo's walking me through the contact list import now. The moment the drive opens and I get the folder path, it goes. Evelyn had moved to stand beside Cole. She was watching the screen. She set the fire extinguisher down carefully, quietly against the bar. She watched the columns of contact names loading on the screen, and her face was very still and very awake. Arthur built that list, she said quietly. Not to anyone specific. He built it name by name, person by person, over 8 months at a kitchen table at 2 a.m, with bad knees and failing eyesight, and the complete certainty that it would matter. Cole glanced at her sideways. He was 26 and had come back from Afghanistan with a skill set and no idea what to do with it. He said quietly, "It's going to matter." She nodded once. Short, certain. 12 minutes. Outside a new sound, engines, not the SUV's different pitch, multiple vehicles coming from the north on the highway. Mason went to the window. Headlights, 3, 4 more, coming fast despite the snow. His phone rang. A number he recognized, a member named Garrett, who lived 40 minutes north and was apparently not 40 minutes north anymore. We're 2 minutes out, Garrett said. 12 bikes and 4 trucks. What do you need? Don't come at the bar, Mason said. Come at the road, north end. Vane has a vehicle on the highway and I need it not on the highway. Copy, Garrett said. 11 minutes. The bullhorn came back, Vane's voice, and something had changed in it, still controlled but tighter. He'd seen the headlights coming from the north. Mr. Turner, what's happening right now does not need to go further than tonight. I am prepared to be very generous with the people in that room. The men in your club have families. They have businesses. They have records that can be complicated or not complicated depending on decisions made tonight. A pause. I'm asking you to think about the people you're responsible for. Mason looked at the room, Cole at the laptop, phone to his ear, Decker at the back with a damaged arm, Trey at the window, Birch still working the phones. Jamie standing near the hallway door at a position that was not formally assigned, but was exactly correct. 8 other men distributed across the room. An old woman with a fire extinguisher in her dead husband's handbag, and 11 minutes left on a clock that was going to change everything or nothing. He walked to the door. He opened it. Vane was there, cold air. The organized positions of his men still held, though Vane's own composure had acquired a new element. Something was moving in those eyes that hadn't been there an hour ago. Control reassessing. The first sign that the man who always had the outcome of meetings predetermined had started to wonder about this one. Mason looked at him for a moment. The people I'm responsible for, Mason said, are in this room. The people Arthur Hartwell was responsible for are 18 names on a list and 1 woman sitting at my bar. The people you're responsible for are whatever's left of your conscience when this is over. He paused. 10 minutes from now, 47 journalists and federal investigators are going to receive simultaneous delivery of 12 years of financial records, death certificates, corporate structures, and photographs, including one photograph that's going to be particularly interesting to the families of the people on Arthur's list. Vane's face didn't move, but something behind it did. You can't contain 47 simultaneous transmissions, Mason said, and you know that because that's exactly what Arthur designed it to prevent. He looked at Vane steadily. So you've got 2 choices. You walk back to your vehicles right now and you start making decisions about the rest of your life. Or you stay here and you make this worse than it already is. He paused. Either way, in 10 minutes, the information moves. He closed the door. He turned back to the room. Cole was on his feet, laptop open, phone still to his ear. His face was the face of a man in the last seconds before something that cannot be undone. Russo's here, Cole said, just pulled in the back. 9 minutes became something different. The door at the back of the bar opened, and a lean, sharp-eyed man in his 40s came in, moving fast, pulling off a wet jacket and already talking before he had it fully off. He looked at Mason. He looked at Cole's screen. He looked at the USB drive in Mason's hand. Give me the drive, Russo said. Mason handed it over. The key. June 14th, 1974, Evelyn said from across the room. Russo looked at her briefly. Something in his face went a little softer for just a moment, the way faces do when they understand the weight behind a set of numbers. Then he turned to Cole's laptop and he began to work. The room held its breath. Evelyn stood very still. Her hand rested on the worn leather of Arthur's handbag. Her eyes were on the screen. She couldn't read from that distance. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She stood the way a person stands at the end of a very long road at the specific moment when everything they've been carrying has been given to the hands it was always meant to reach. And then Russo said quietly, I'm in. I'm in. In 2 words. Russo said them quietly the way people say things that are actually enormous. Not with drama, not with announcement, just the flat factual delivery of a man reporting a condition. But those 2 words went through the room like current through a wire. Cole exhaled so hard he had to brace himself on the bar. Trey turned from the window. Even Decker, back against the rear hallway door with his damaged arm held close to his body, lifted his chin. Evelyn didn't move. She stood exactly where she had been standing. One hand on the handbag, and her face did something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, and was probably the specific combination of both that happens when something a person has been holding for over a year finally passes out of their hands. Russo was already working. His fingers moved across Cole's laptop with the focused efficiency of someone who had done things like this under conditions considerably worse than a Montana biker bar in a November snowstorm. Contact list, he said without looking up. Arthur's Garden folder found it. 47 recipients. Cross-referencing with the pre-staged distribution I built in the car. A pause. His encryption was good, really good. Consumer-grade tools don't crack this. He had help, or he was self-taught to a level that's genuinely impressive. He was self-taught to every level that was necessary, Evelyn said. Russo glanced back at her. Smart man. The smartest man I ever knew, she said. He just looked like an accountant. How long? Mason said. And loading the attachment packages now. Financial records, photographs, the mapped corporate architecture, the death cross-reference files. Russo's eyes moved rapidly across the screen. 7 minutes to full package assembly, then simultaneous send across all 47. Once it goes everywhere at once. Email encrypted file sharing 2 separate document repository systems Arthur set up. You'd need to shut down the entire internet backbone of 6 states to stop it. And even then, half of these contacts have auto-download enabled, which means the files are already on their machines the moment the send initiates. Vane doesn't know we're this close, Trey said. No, Mason said, and I'd like to keep it that way for 6 more minutes. Mayat, as if the name had summoned him, the bullhorn outside crackled back to life. Vane's voice had changed again. The patience was still there technically, but it was the patience of a man applying pressure to a wound that he knew was serious. Mr. Turner, I want to be direct with you. The individuals outside this building are authorized to take any necessary steps to recover stolen federal property. The material Mrs. Hartwell is carrying was obtained illegally from a classified contractor archive. Possession of that material exposes every person in that bar to federal prosecution. A pause. I'm giving you a final opportunity to resolve this without consequences for your people. Last, Trey looked at Mason. Stolen federal property, that's new. He's escalating the legal frame, Mason said, trying to make the men in this room think they're the criminals. He looked around at the assembled faces, 14 men, some of them with priors, some of them with the kind of records that made the word federal prosecution land with real weight. Anybody in this room having second thoughts, speak now, no judgment. This is not your fight. Silence. Not the silence of people holding back. The silence of people who have already decided. Then Birch from the far side of the room said, Caleb rode with me for 3 years. We did the Sturgis run together twice. He used to call me Uncle Birch, even though I am not remotely old enough to be his uncle, and I told him that every single time. He paused. Nobody in this room is having second thoughts. Several men spoke at once, brief and overlapping, the collective sound of a decision that had already been made finding its voice. Mason nodded once. He turned back to Russo. 6 minutes. 5.5, Russo corrected. I found a shortcut in Arthur's architecture. He pre-compressed the financial files. Smart. The man was planning this send even when he built the original encryption. He planned everything, Evelyn said softly. He was always planning. I used to tease him about it. I'd say, Arthur, we're going on a picnic, not a military operation. And he'd look at me and say, Evelyn, the difference between a good picnic and a bad one is exactly the same as the difference between a good military operation and a bad one. Preparation and the willingness to adapt. Her voice was gentle with memory. He was right about that too. 5 minutes. Mason went to the window. Vane's people had not moved from their positions. The road vehicle was still there, but something had changed in the formation, a subtle tightening. Men who had been standing at ease, now standing differently. They were preparing for something. Mason looked north on the highway and saw that Garrett's convoy had arrived and was staging on the far side of Vane's road vehicle, 12 motorcycles and 4 trucks in, a loose line headlights on engines running. Not moving yet, just present. The specific statement of a wall that hasn't been asked to move yet, but is very clear about the fact that it exists. Vane could see them too. Mason pulled out his phone and called Garrett. Hold your position. Don't engage. I need 4 more minutes. Holding, Garrett said, then quieter. Mason, there's a sheriff's vehicle coming south on the highway, about 8 minutes out. I can see the lights. 1 vehicle. 1 for now. Let it through when it comes. Don't block law enforcement. Mason thought for a moment. But make sure they see the full setup before they get to the bar. Let them understand what they're arriving into. Understood, Garrett said. 4 minutes. The back door moved. Not a ram this time, something more deliberate. A sound of tools. Decker pressed himself against the door from the inside and looked at Mason. They're working the hinges, he said. Got maybe 90 seconds on this door. Hold it as long as you can. Mason, my arm. I know. Hold it as long as you can. Mason turned to the room. Jamie, Birch, back door. He looked at 3 other men by name and pointed them to positions. No panic, no shouting. The room reorganized itself in under 15 seconds. Evelyn had picked the fire extinguisher back up. Mason looked at her. Don't, she said before he could speak. Mrs. Hartwell, I am not going to the back office, she said. I am not going to stand in a room by myself while the people protecting me get hurt. I held that door between my classroom and a hallway with an active shooter for 11 minutes in 2003, and I am not the woman you think I am, Mr. Turner. She paused. I am significantly more inconvenient. Mason looked at her for 1 full second. Then he said, stay low, stay behind Birch. Agreed. 3 minutes. The back door shuddered, then again harder. Decker and Jamie and Birch were braced against it now. 3 large men, and the door was holding, but it was a conversation that the door was losing. From outside came voices, controlled, professional, the specific verbal cadence of men executing a plan. Then a sound from the front of the building. Not the door, the window specifically, an object striking the glass, testing it, not breaking it, testing it. They're coordinating, Trey said. He was at the front window flat against the wall beside it. Simultaneous breach attempt, front and back at the same time. They want to split. Don't split, Mason said. Front window is reinforced. That's the original 1987 installation 1/4-inch polycarbonate behind the glass. They'll break the glass and hit the poly, and it'll hold long enough. He looked at Russo. How long? 2 minutes 20, Russo said. He was not looking up from the screen. His voice was the voice of a man in a tunnel, hearing nothing but the work. 2 minutes 10 now. 2 minutes. The front glass broke. The sound of it was sudden and sharp, and 3 men near the front flinched involuntarily. Not fear, just the body's honest response to a loud, unexpected noise. The polycarbonate held exactly as Mason said it would. A face appeared briefly in the gap, assessed, disappeared. The back door took a longer hit, and Decker made a sound, not a cry. Something more compressed, the sound of pain being managed rather than expressed. Decker, Mason said. I'm fine, Decker said through his teeth. I'm fine, hold the count. 90 seconds, Russo said. Better than. Evelyn moved. She moved without asking anyone, without announcing it, the way people with 31 years of classroom management move, direct and purposeful, and with a complete absence of drama. She moved to the back door, and she pressed herself into the gap on the hinge side between Decker and the wall, and she put her shoulder against the door. She weighed maybe 120 pounds. She pressed her shoulder against that door. Decker looked at her sideways, grimacing. Ma'am. Shut up and hold, she said. 60 seconds. Mason stood in the center of the room. He was perfectly still. All around him, the bar was alive with motion and sound, in the specific, barely managed chaos of a situation that is one decision away from becoming something irreversible. The front poly was flexing under repeated impact. The back door was breathing. Trey was at the front, calling positions. Cole was standing beside Russo, watching the screen. The clock on Russo's operation was in the final seconds. Even in the middle of all of it, in the dead center of the particular storm that Arthur Hartwell had spent 2 years designing, and Richard Vane had spent 12 years trying to prevent Mason, Turner felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not peace, not calm, something older and more specific than either the feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing at exactly the right moment. He picked up Arthur's photograph of Caleb. He looked at it one more time. The 28-year-old face, the weight-forward stance, the way he stood like a man who'd spent his whole life on a motorcycle and never learned to stand differently. I know, kid, he thought. I know. Sending, Russo said. One word, not two this time. One, sending, present tense, active, unstoppable. Cole grabbed the edge of the bar with both hands. Russo's finger was on the key, and then it wasn't, and the screen showed 47 progress bars beginning to fill simultaneously, and Russo said quieter this time, "It's moving." The back door took a final hit, and the lower hinge gave way, and the door swung at an angle held by the top hinge and by Decker and Jamie and Birch, and 120 pounds of retired Montana schoolteacher who did not let go until Mason said, "It's done, pull back, let them in." The door swung open. Two men came through, fast-moving tactically, and they found themselves standing in the center of a biker bar surrounded by 14 men who were not attacking them and not retreating and simply standing there looking at them with the specific expression of people who have nothing left to protect because it has already been protected. The two men looked at each other, then at the room, then at Mason. "It's already gone," Mason said. 47 recipients, simultaneous. It's been moving for 45 seconds, which means at least a third of your targets have already received and auto-downloaded the full package. He looked at them steadily. "You can arrest everyone in this room right now and it doesn't matter. You can burn this building to the ground and it doesn't matter. Arthur Hartwell is already everywhere." One of the two men reached for a radio. Mason let him. The front door opened 30 seconds later. Not breached, opened. Vane walked in and the room was quiet enough that his footsteps were audible and his face was a controlled study in a man who has just received news he was not prepared for through his earpiece and is processing it in real time while maintaining a composed exterior. He was almost successful. The exterior was almost intact. But Mason had spent 30 years reading men under pressure, and what he saw in Richard Vane's face in that moment was the specific expression of someone watching a future they believed was secured begin to come apart along seams they thought were welded shut. Vane looked at Russo's laptop, at the 47 completed progress bars, at the timestamp at the bottom of the screen. He looked at Evelyn. She was standing against the back wall, fire extinguisher still in hand, shoulder that had been pressed against the door for 60 seconds, probably going to ache for a week, and she looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has delivered what her husband asked her to deliver and who is now done being afraid. "It's over," Mason said. Vane's composure reassembled itself with visible effort. "Nothing is over," he said. His voice was controlled, but the smoothness was gone. "You've transmitted unverified documents of questionable provenance to individuals who will be immediately contacted by our legal team. The chain of custody on those files is non-existent. Arthur Hartwell was a disgruntled former contractor with documented mental health concerns." "Name one documented concern," Evelyn said. "Name the date and the documentation." Vane looked at her. His jaw tightened slightly. "Name it," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was the voice she had used for 31 years with students who thought they could bluff their way through her classroom. Because Arthur kept records of every professional interaction he had. "If there is documentation of a mental health concern involving my husband, it exists somewhere with a date and a signature," and Arthur noted it. She paused. "Can you name it?" Silence. "No," she said, "you can't, because it doesn't exist. Because Arthur was the most meticulous man who ever lived, and he was entirely in his right mind when he built those files, and everyone who worked with him for 30 years would say exactly that under oath." She set the fire extinguisher down carefully. "You've been saying he was unstable for 14 months because that was your only defense. But the files speak for themselves. 47 people are looking at them right now, and what they're seeing is 12 years of evidence that is documented, dated, cross-referenced, and built by someone who was clearly and demonstrably not unstable. He was right, and he was afraid, and he died before he could do this himself, so I did it for him." The room was absolutely still. Vane looked at her for a long moment. The composure was there, but it was load-bearing now, visibly working, not naturally present. He said, "You have no idea what you've started." "I know exactly what I've started," Evelyn said. Arthur told me. He said it would be messy and long, and that powerful people would spend a lot of money trying to discredit everything. He said there would be delays and legal battles, and that some of the people on his list would get pressured and back down. She paused. He also said that some of them wouldn't. He said that's all it takes, some of them not backing down. The sound of a vehicle outside, then voices, then a knock on the doorframe. The actual front door was still technically functional, held open at an angle by one of Vane's men, who seemed uncertain about what his role was now. A sheriff's deputy stepped inside. Young, maybe 26, clearly not prepared for the tableau in front of him. 14 bikers, 2 of Vane's men. Vane himself, a woman with a fire extinguisher and a laptop displaying 47 green completion bars. He stopped in the doorway and his hand moved toward his belt before he got himself under control. We received a call about. He looked around. Is anyone injured? Decker needs his arm looked at, Mason said. He braced a door that was being rammed. The men who rammed it are the 2 standing in the back. He looked at the deputy levelly. You might want to get your sergeant on the phone before you decide who to talk to first tonight. The deputy looked at Vane. Vane said nothing. The deputy pulled out his phone. And Mason turned away from both of them because the next 30 minutes were going to be complicated and administrative and would involve a lot of people explaining things to other people. And that was fine, that was manageable, that was the kind of problem that had a process. He turned to the thing that didn't have a process. He crossed the room to Evelyn. She had finally set the fire extinguisher all the way down and was sitting in the nearest chair. Not his table, just the closest available chair. And she was holding Arthur's handbag in her lap, and her hands had stopped shaking. Sometime in the last 20 minutes. Somewhere between the back door giving way and the 47 green bars on the screen, and they were still now. She looked smaller sitting down. She looked like a 76-year-old woman who had been awake for too many hours and had carried too much weight for too many months and had just put it down. She looked, Mason thought, like exactly what she was. A woman who loved her husband completely and had honored that love to the absolute limit of what honoring something can require. He pulled a chair across from her and sat down. She looked at him. It moved, he said. Yes. 47 people. Yes, she paused. Do you think any of them will? Some of them will back down, Mason said. Vane was right about that part. Some of them will get pressured and go quiet. That's how it works. He paused. But not all 47. Arthur built that list for 2 years precisely because he believed in those specific people, and it only takes some of them. He paused again. I think he picked well. She looked down at the handbag. Her hand rested on it for a moment, the way a hand rests on something you've been carrying so long it's become part of your body, and you're not sure how to exist without the weight. Then she looked up. His coin, she said. You still have it. Mason reached into his chest pocket. He placed the coin on the table between them. She looked at it for a long moment. He carried that for 20 years, she said. He said it was a reminder that a promise made and kept is the most honest thing a person can do. She didn't pick it up. I think he'd want you to keep it. I think he'd want you to have it back, Mason said. He'd want it to stay where it ended up, she said. He sent it here. He sent me here. He sent everything here. She folded her hands around the handbag and looked at Mason with those clear, exhausted eyes. Arthur was never wrong about people. Irritatingly, consistently, accurately, not wrong. In 43 years, I argued with him about people 100 times, and he was right every time. A faint, complicated smile crossed her face. He was right about you. Mawson didn't say anything. He picked the coin up and held it in his closed hand. The metal was a room temperature, now warmed through no longer carrying cold. In from across the room came Cole's voice. Mason, first response, Denver. Her editor, the contact on Arthur's list. He received the package, and he's already pulled his legal team. Says they're going to press, regardless of pressure. A pause. He says, quote, tell whoever sent this that Arthur Hartwell is going to be a name people remember. We're going to make sure of that. Evelyn pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright. She held it together. Good, she said. It came out a little rough around the edges, but it came out. Wow. The deputy was on his second call now, speaking in low, urgent tones near the front door. One of Vane's men had sat down on a bar stool without being asked, not in surrender exactly, more in the posture of someone waiting for instructions. that weren't coming. Vane himself was standing very still, near the door phone in hand, face closed, doing whatever calculation a man in his position does when the thing he built over 12 years and protected at the cost of 18 lives has just been released simultaneously into 47 sets of hands he cannot reach. Miles Boyson watched him. He wanted to feel something about it: anger, satisfaction, the specific cold settling of an account. He felt none of those things. He felt the coin in his hand and the weight of Caleb's photograph on the table, and the presence of a small woman who had walked through a Montana blizzard on wrong shoes to deliver her dead husband's most important work to the right people. That was enough. A tray appeared at his shoulder. Garrett wants to know if he should stand down the road line. Tell him to hold for now. Mason looked at the deputy still on the phone. We don't know what's coming from the south yet. You think Vane has more people coming? I think Vane always has more people coming, Mason said. But I also think that 47 simultaneous transmissions changes the calculation on what those people are coming to accomplish. He paused. When your operations exposure is already in motion, adding an incident at a biker bar in Montana is not helpful. It's evidence. Trey considered this. So we just wait. We wait, Mason said. Arthur spent 2 years building something designed for this specific moment. We're going to let it work. Trey nodded slowly. Then he said quieter, how are you doing with the Caleb thing? Awesome. Mason was quiet for a moment. I'm going to deal with that, he said. There's a process for it. There's a conversation with his mother that I have to have that I am not going to be ready for, and I'm going to do it anyway. There's Gary Pruitt somewhere in California who I am going to find, and that's a different process. He paused. Right now, I'm doing what needs to be done. The rest comes after. While Trey put his hand briefly on Mason's shoulder, said nothing, took it away. That was the language of the room, gesture presence, the communication of men who have been in enough situations together that words are often the least efficient option. Birch materialized from the direction of the back hallway. His shirt was torn at the shoulder from the door situation, but he looked otherwise intact. He was holding a tray. On the tray were mugs of coffee. He had apparently in the middle of a siege made coffee. He set the tray on the bar without explanation. Then he looked at Evelyn. Ma'am, he said, you did good tonight. She looked at the tray. She looked at Birch. She said, the coffee smells wonderful. Mummy, Birch almost smiled. It should. I've been making it in this bar for 12 years. I know what I'm doing. She took a mug. Birch distributed the others. The deputy on the phone glanced at the tray with an expression of involuntary longing, and Decker arm in an improvised sling that Jamie had fashioned from a bar towel silently slid a mug toward him without comment. Only Russo called from across the room. Second response, investigative reporter in D.C. She's already running verification on the corporate documentation. Says she knows 3 of the shell companies from a previous story she couldn't prove. Says, he paused reading. Says she's been waiting 2 years for something like this to surface, and she's going to run it with or without her editor's approval. And a third response came before Russo finished reading the second. Then a fourth. Then 2 at once, Russo's voice taking on the quality of a man reading, water rising rather than falling, each level higher than the one before, accumulating, unstoppable. Mason stood in the center of his bar and listened to his people read him the names of 47 honest individuals, opening their email and finding 12 years of documented truth and deciding what to do with it. Outside, the engines of Vane's SUVs started, one by one, not roaring, just starting, the sound of vehicles preparing to leave rather than preparing to act. Trey was at the window. They're pulling out, he said. He sounded almost surprised. The road vehicle first, now the east side. A pause. They're leaving. Vane told them to pull back, Mason said. He didn't go to the window. He already knew. The calculus changed the moment the transmission's completed. Being here is no longer an advantage. Being here is a liability. So they just go. After all of this, they just go. For now, Mason said, this is not the end of Vane. Arthur's files start the process, they don't finish it. There are going to be lawyers and federal inquiries, and Vane has enough money to delay things for years. He paused. But delay is not the same as escape. Arthur built this so it couldn't be made to disappear. Vane can fight it, but he can't make it not exist anymore. The deputy ended his call. He looked at Mason. He looked at the bar generally, the broken front glass, the damaged back door, Decker's arm, the two men from Vane's crew still sitting in the room, the laptop displaying 47 green bars. He looked slightly overwhelmed in the specific way that people look overwhelmed when reality has delivered a situation that no professional training adequately prepared them for. I need statements, he said, and from he gestured broadly. Everyone. Tomorrow, Mason said. Tonight we need a medic for my man's arm. We need those two individuals formally identified and not permitted to leave. And we need someone to call the two agents who Arthur listed on page 31 of his documentation as paid contacts of Vane's Strategic Solutions and make sure they are not the first law enforcement responders to this scene. The deputy blinked. What? Page 31, Evelyn said from her chair. She reached into the handbag and produced a copy of the relevant page. She had made copies. Of course, Arthur's instructions had accounted for this and held it across the room. Those two names, they're on a payment record. It would be very unfortunate if they were the first people to take custody of any evidence tonight. The deputy took the page. He read it. His face cycled through several expressions. He picked up his phone again. Mason watched him, then he turned back to Russo. Keep logging the responses. Everyone that confirms receipt, timestamp it. We're going to need a record of the distribution timeline. Already on it, Russo said. Another response came in, then two more. Russo started calling them out as they arrived, and the names of journalists and federal investigators and attorneys filled the bar. The way music fills a bar, not loud but present, accumulating, giving the room a quality it hadn't had an hour ago. Evelyn sat in her chair with her coffee and her handbag, and she listened to the names, and her face was very still and very open, and what lived in it was something that couldn't quite be named, not happiness exactly, too heavy for happiness, not relief too complicated for relief. The specific feeling of something that was supposed to happen, finally happening, even if it happened later than it should have, even if it cost more than it should have cost. She reached into the handbag one more time. She removed the pages of Arthur's letter that she had folded and kept to herself from earlier in the night, the personal parts, the parts she said she was keeping. She held them against her chest once briefly, like pressing a hand against a bruise that has finally started to heal. Then she put them back carefully and folded the handbag closed and sat with her coffee and the sound of 47 names, and she was for the first time in 14 months not running. Cole's voice from across the room. 22 confirmed receipts, 23, 24. He was counting them aloud now, and he didn't explain why, but nobody needed him to. The counting was for Caleb. It was for Marcus Webb. It was for the attorney who'd been sober 11 years and the journalist who'd grown up sailing on Lake Michigan and the federal investigator who'd been reassigned and the 18 people whose names Arthur Hartwell had written in small, precise handwriting in a notebook that Evelyn had carried through a snowstorm in wrong shoes. 25, Cole said. 26. Mason Turner sat down across from Evelyn Hartwell and picked up his bourbon, which had been sitting untouched on the table since before she walked in, and held it but did not drink it. He looked at the coin on the table between them. He looked at the photograph of Caleb. He looked at the laptop screen across the room where the numbers were still climbing. He built it well, he said. Arthur. He did everything well, she said, slowly and carefully and well. A pause, then Mason said, the people who took him, they're going to have lawyers and resources, and they're going to fight this for years. I know. It might not be clean. It might not be fast. Arthur told me that. She looked at Mason steadily. He said justice is not fast. He said justice is like accounting. It requires patience and precision and the willingness to follow numbers through 17 layers of complication until they tell you the truth. He said the difference between justice and revenge is that revenge is satisfying immediately, and then it's over, and justice takes so long that by the time it arrives, you've almost forgotten what it was for. She paused. He said it's worth it anyway. 31, Cole said. 32. Decker lowered himself onto a bar stool, arm held carefully, and accepted a second mug of coffee from Jamie. Birch was on the phone again, telling Garrett's convoy they could stand down. Trey was watching the front with the particular attention of someone who believed the problem was over but was not yet ready to believe it was fully over. And Richard Vane was gone. His vehicles, his people, his bullhorn, and his patience and his 12 years of carefully constructed insulation from consequence. All of it pulling back into the Montana night, not disappeared, not destroyed, but exposed. Documented. named, in 47 inboxes and on 47 screens and in the hands of 47 people Arthur Hartwell had spent 8 months deciding he could trust. The bar smelled like coffee and cold air from the broken window and the particular human warmth of many people in a small space who have been through something together. 38, Cole said. 39. If Evelyn looked at Mason, she said quietly, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me when Vane's in a courtroom." "I'll thank you now," she said. "And then again then." 43, Cole said. His voice had gone slightly rough. 44. Mason looked at the coin on the table. He picked it up. He thought about his father carrying it through Vietnam and giving it to a man named Gerald Cotton at a reunion in 1994, and Gerald Cotton giving it to an accountant from Billings named Arthur Hartwell, who helped his son into a treatment program, and Arthur Hartwell carrying it for 20 years and pressing it into his wife's hand before he died, and Evelyn Hartwell carrying it through a Montana blizzard in wrong shoes and laying it on a table in a biker bar at 2 in the morning. An object that had moved through 30 years and 4 pairs of hands and ended up exactly where it needed to be. 46, Cole said. 47. All 47. Every name on Arthur's list. All of them at once as fast as possible. Exactly the way Arthur had designed it. Cole set down his phone. He pressed his hands flat on the bar and he stared at the screen for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "That's for you, Marcus." Nobody spoke. And the snow was still falling outside. The engines of the remaining Iron Vultures bikes were still running. The laptop screen glowed with 47 green bars, and the timestamp at the bottom of the screen recorded the exact moment that Arthur Hartwell's 2 years of careful, patient, meticulous, frightened, determined work became impossible to stop. 3:47 a.m., a Friday night in November in rural Montana, and the night was not over. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m., and the snow was still falling, and nobody in the Iron Vultures bar was going home. Not because they couldn't. The road was technically passable now. Garrett's convoy had confirmed it when they staged on the highway. Vane's vehicles were gone, his men were gone. The 2 contractors who'd come through the back door were sitting in zip ties waiting for the second sheriff's deputy, who was apparently 40 minutes out and moving carefully in the snow. Nobody was stopping anyone from leaving. Nobody left. And they stayed the way people stay after something significant has happened, in a place not because there's more to do exactly, but because leaving feels wrong, feels like walking away from something before it's finished settling. Decker stayed with his arm in a bar towel sling. Birch stayed on his phone fielding calls from members who'd heard something was happening and wanted to know the status. Cole stayed at the laptop beside Russo, both of them monitoring the inbox responses that were still coming in as journalists on the East Coast woke up to their morning email and opened Arthur's files for the first time. Evelyn stayed. She had moved finally from the chair near the back wall to Mason's table, his actual table, the one in the back left corner where he always sat facing the door. He'd offered it to her without ceremony, just stood up and gestured, and she'd moved to it with the same directness she'd used to cross the room 4 hours ago. She sat with her coffee in Arthur's handbag and the quiet that had settled over her like something long overdue. Around 4 in the morning, she asked Birch if there was anything to eat. Birch looked at her like she'd asked something obvious. "Of course there's something to eat," he said, which was how Evelyn Hartwell ended up sitting at Mason Turner's table, eating scrambled eggs that Birch made on the bar's back kitchen burner at 4 in the morning, while federal investigators in 6 states were opening encrypted files and a deputy sheriff was taking statements from 2 men who had rammed a door with a tactical ram and were now discovering that this specific sequence of decisions had not been their best work. The eggs were good, she said so. Birch nodded once satisfied and made more for anyone who wanted them, which turned out to be everyone. And there is something about shared food in the aftermath of something hard that does what nothing else quite does. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't resolve anything. It just makes the people in a room feel like people again, rather than positions in a conflict. Mason noticed this. He ate his eggs and drank his coffee and watched his people come back to themselves around a bar top, covered in scrambled eggs and Arthur Hartwell's photographs and the detritus of a night that none of them had been prepared for. Russo called out responses as they came. By 5 a.m. 31 of the 47 contacts had confirmed receipt and indicated intent to pursue. 3 had responded with immediate questions asking for authentication support, which Russo was providing. Two had not responded at all, which Russo said was either sleeping or backing down, and they'd know which by morning. The remaining 11 were in time zones where it was still the middle of the night. At 5:22 a.m., Cole's phone rang. He looked at the screen, looked at Mason. "It's the Denver journalist," and he said, "the one whose editor broke the Vane story that got retracted." "Put it on speaker," Mason said. Cole answered and set the phone on the table. A woman's voice came through clear and alert in the way of someone who had been awake for hours and was running on the specific fuel of a story that was real. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge," she said. "That's me," Mason said. "My name is Sarah Okafor. I write investigative pieces for the Denver Courier. I've been going through Arthur Hartwell's files for the last 2 hours." A pause. "I need you to understand what you sent me tonight. Tell me." The corporate mapping alone is the most thorough documentation of defense contractor fraud I have ever seen. I've been covering this industry for 11 years. I have a source inside the DoD who's been trying to get someone to look at Vane Strategic for 3 years and couldn't find anyone willing to run with it because the documentation was always incomplete. Another pause longer. "Arthur Hartwell's files are not incomplete. They are," she stopped. "They are the kind of documentation that prosecutors dream about. The cross-referencing between the financial records and the death timeline alone, I've sent it to 2 attorneys I trust, and both of them used the word airtight within 5 minutes of each other." The room had gone quiet. Everyone was listening. "The photograph of your member," she said. "Caleb Marsh. I need to know, was his family informed about the possible connection?" Mason looked at his hands. "Not yet," he said. "That conversation happens today." I want to be careful about how we handle that in the reporting," Sarah said. "His name deserves to be in the story. He deserves to be named as a witness who paid the highest price. But I want to do that right. I want to talk to his family before anything publishes." "You'll have access," Mason said. "But I make that call first, not you." "Agreed," she said immediately. "Absolutely agreed." A pause. "One more thing. Evelyn Hartwell. Is she there?" Mason looked at Evelyn. She nodded. "Mrs. Hartwell," Sarah said, "your husband built something extraordinary. I want you to know, and I say this as someone who has watched a lot of important stories get buried, this one is not getting buried. I don't have the words for what he did, but I want you to know that I understand what it cost." The bar was very quiet. Aunt to Evelyn said, "He would have liked you. He made a list of honest people, and you were on it. That means he read your work and believed in you before you ever knew his name." She paused. "Don't let him down." "I won't," Sarah said. No hesitation, no qualification, just the 2 words clean and direct the way Arthur would have appreciated. Cole ended the call. He looked at the phone for a moment. Then he looked up, and his eyes were red at the edges, and he did not explain this, and no one asked him to. Isha, the second deputy, arrived at 5:40 a.m. He was older, mid-40s, with the particular bearing of someone who had been doing this long enough to not be surprised by most things, but was currently being surprised by this thing. He spent 40 minutes taking preliminary statements, secured the 2 contractors for transport, and made 3 separate calls during which his expression cycled through confusion, concern, and the careful blankness of a man who has just been told something about colleagues he respected that he is not yet ready to fully believe. When he had read page 31, he had made those calls. At 6:30, he came to Mason and said quietly, "The 2 names on that list. One of them was my supervisor for 4 years. He stopped. "I need you to understand that I didn't know." "I believe you," Mason said. "I need to know that this," he gestured toward the laptop, toward the night in general. "I need to know this is going to go somewhere, that it's not going to disappear." 34 confirmed recipients as of an hour ago, Mason said. Journalists, federal investigators, 2 attorneys who specialize in defense contractor prosecution. The files are already downloaded on their systems. The only way it disappears now is if every one of those people simultaneously decides to bury it. He paused. Arthur Hartwell spent 8 months making sure the list didn't include people who bury things. The deputy looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, the nod of a man making a private decision that he would not be articulating. He went back to his paperwork. It was almost 7 a.m. when the first television network picked it up. Russo saw it first, an alert on his phone from a media monitoring service he subscribed to. He looked at it, looked again, then said with the measured tone of someone trying not to get ahead of what the facts actually said, "National broadcast, defense contractor, fraud allegations. Multiple sources citing documentation received this morning." He looked up. "They're not naming Vane yet, but they're naming the shell companies. 3 of them by name." Cole made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "That's Arthur," Evelyn said. She didn't say it loudly. She said it to herself or to the handbag or to the coin that was still on the table between her and Mason. That's Arthur finally being heard. The light had changed outside, that specific quality of light that means the sun is coming, even if it can't be seen yet through the clouds and the snow. The bar had been a dark place all night, lit by its own interior lights against the Montana dark, and now the darkness outside was retreating, and the light coming in the broken front window. The polycarbonate still holding the outer glass gone was the thin gray light of a November dawn that was indifferent to everything that had happened in this room, but arrived anyway as it always did. Mason stood. He walked to the broken window and looked out at the parking lot and the highway beyond, and the snowfield stretching north toward Garanid's group, who had finally stood down and were in the process of the long goal ride home. He thought about Caleb. He thought about the ride to Caleb's mother's house that he was going to make today as soon as it was a reasonable hour, and what he was going to say, and how he was going to say it, and the fact that there was no version of that conversation that wasn't going to break something in both of them permanently. And he thought that he would do it anyway, that it was owed, that the truth about how her son had died was something she had the right to, regardless of what it cost to deliver it. That was what Caleb would have wanted. Caleb, who had gone to Arizona and seen something in a supply yard and had apparently been trying to figure out what to do about it when someone decided he needed to stop figuring. Caleb, who had called Trey 6 months before he died and asked a few quiet questions about how a person would go about documenting something they'd seen at a military installation, and Trey had said he didn't know and suggested he talk to a lawyer, and Caleb had said, yeah, maybe, and then changed the subject. Trey had told Mason this at 5 in the morning, sitting at the bar with cold coffee, and his voice had been the voice of a man holding himself responsible for something he could not reasonably be held responsible for, and doing it anyway. Mason had said, "You couldn't have known." "I know," Trey said. "Doesn't change it." "No," Mason agreed. "It doesn't, but you do your time with that, and then you put it where it belongs." Caleb would tell you the same thing. Trey had nodded. Then after a moment he said, "He was going to tell me eventually. He trusted us. He just needed more time." "He didn't have more time," Mason said. "That's on Vane, not on you." And the twist had come quietly, the way the deepest ones always do not. In the middle of the siege, not in the confrontation with Vane, but in the aftermath, in Trey's voice at 5 in the morning. The revelation that the club had almost known, that Caleb had been circling the truth and had trusted the Iron Vultures enough to start asking and had just needed a few more weeks. That the gap between almost and actually was a boy's life. Mason stood at the window and let that settle in him, the way hard things settle, not disappearing, not resolved, just finding the place they were going to live in permanently. Behind him, the bar had grown quieter. Some of the men had finally gone birch after extracting multiple promises that people would eat actual food today. Jamie, who had been awake for 22 hours and finally sat down in a corner chair and went to sleep with his jacket over him, and nobody woke him. Russo, who had handed the monitoring to Cole and left with the laptop and a set of authentication credentials to continue working from his car on the way home. The ones who remained were the ones who couldn't quite leave yet. Cole sat with his phone, Decker sat with his arm, Trey sat with his thoughts. And Evelyn sat at Mason's table with her empty coffee mug and Arthur's handbag and the quiet of a woman who had put down the things she was carrying and was learning in real time what it felt like to have empty hands. Mason came back to the table and sat down. She looked at him. "What do you do now?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "I haven't thought past this." Arthur's instructions ended here. A pause. "I have a house in Billings, friends. My daughter is in Seattle and has been calling me every day for 2 weeks because she knows something is wrong, and I haven't been able to tell her." She looked at the handbag. "I'm going to call her today. I'm going to tell her everything. She's going to be furious with me for not telling her sooner, and she's going to be on a plane before I finish the sentence." "Good," Mason said. Yes, she agreed. Good. She looked at him. And you, what do you do now? Same as always, he said. Run the club, keep the people I'm responsible for safe. Have a very hard conversation with a mother in Missoula. He paused. Find Gary Pruitt in California. She looked at him steadily. Be careful with that last one. I'll be legal, he said, not exactly what she'd said, but what he could honestly promise. She accepted it. They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of two people who had been through enough together in a single night to have moved past the kind of silence that requires filling. And then Evelyn reached into the handbag one last time. She removed a photograph that Mason hadn't seen, not from Arthur's evidence files, a different kind of photograph. A personal one. Two people at a kitchen table, a man in bifocals, and a woman with blonde hair laughing at something, the light of a morning coming in behind them. The kind of photograph that gets taken on an ordinary day without anyone thinking it will be important. She looked at it for a moment. This is the last photograph taken of Arthur before he got sick, she said. His birthday? March. We were having breakfast and my daughter was visiting and she took it on her phone and sent it to me and I printed it because I print everything. I'm old-fashioned that way. She set it on the table, not facing Mason, just set it down facing up so the man in bifocals was looking at the ceiling of the Iron Vulture's bar in the early morning light. He never got to see any of this, she said. He spent 2 years building it and 14 months before it happened. Her voice was even. The grief in it was the familiar kind worn smooth. I think about that. I think about whether he would have been satisfied or whether he would have found 17 things that could have been documented better. She almost smiled. Probably both. That was Arthur. He got it right, Mason said. The things that mattered, he got right. He did, she said. Dan, he got the list right. He got you right. She looked at Mason. He got me right, which took 43 years of practice, and I gave him significant difficulty the entire time. Bonas Mason said nothing. He was looking at the photograph of the man in bifocals who had spent 2 years being afraid and meticulous and determined, and had sent his wife through a Montana snowstorm with a coin and a USB drive and the address of a biker bar, and had been right about every single calculation except the one that let him see how it ended. Cole's voice from across the room. Mason, you need to see this. And he walked over. Cole turned his phone so Mason could see the screen. A news alert. Not a network broadcast this time, but a wire service. The language was careful, preliminary. The hedged phrasing of journalism working ahead of full confirmation. But the words were there. Federal investigators, vain strategic solutions, defense contractor, fraud allegations, documentary, evidence received by multiple news organizations. And at the bottom of the alert, one more line, preliminary confirmation that federal investigators in Washington were opening a review. Cole looked at Mason. It's starting, he said. It started 2 years ago, Mason said, when Arthur Hartwell found a number that didn't add up and couldn't let it go. He walked the phone back to the table and set it in front of Evelyn. She read it. She read it twice. Her face was very still for a long moment. Then she picked up the photograph of Arthur at the kitchen table, and she held it up briefly toward the screen, a gesture so private and so complete that nobody in the room said anything about it. She set it back down. She picked up her empty coffee mug and looked at it. Is there any more? She asked. Always Birch called from somewhere he was not supposed to still be. He appeared from the back hallway with a fresh pot, impossibly as though he had never actually left, as though Birch had been making coffee in this bar for 12 years, and intended to continue doing so regardless of federal investigations, tactical rammings, or the general collapse of the situation. He filled her mug, he filled Mason's. He moved around the table and filled everyone else's without being asked, and then he put the pot back and he leaned against the bar and he said, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Hartwell, and I know it's probably worth less than a lot of things that happened tonight, I'm glad you came through that door." She looked at him. "I'm glad I came through that door too," she said. "I wasn't entirely sure I was going to." She paused. Arthur was sure. He was always sure about people. Another pause. "I married him anyway." What the Birch laughed. It was the first real laugh in the bar since the night began, and it moved through the remaining men like something physical. Brief, genuine, the sound of people who have been through something hard finding that they are still capable of the thing that means they're okay. Trey laughed. Cole laughed. Decker made a sound with his damaged arm that was as close to a laugh as physics allowed. Mason didn't laugh, but his face did something that the people who knew him well recognized as the closest available equivalent, and Evelyn Hartwell saw it and nodded once very slightly, as if confirming something she had expected to find. The snow stopped sometime around 8 in the morning. The light that came in then was real clean. November light, the kind that makes everything look very clear and very cold and very permanent. The Iron Vulture's bar looked in that light exactly like what it was, a bar in rural Montana with a broken front window and a damaged back door, and a table covered in photographs and coffee mugs, and one worn leather handbag, and the evidence of a night that had changed things in ways that would take months and years to fully understand. And the legal proceedings that followed were exactly what Mason had told Evelyn they would be. Long, complicated, expensive. Vane's legal team was formidable, and they fought every document in every timeline in every connection Arthur had mapped. 3 of the 47 contacts backed down under pressure. 2 stories were delayed by legal injunctions that ultimately failed. A senator's chief of staff resigned quietly and the senator claimed no knowledge. 2 federal investigations were opened, merged, separated, and remerged over the following 18 months. And Gary Pruitt was found in Sacramento, and what happened with Gary Pruitt was handled in a way that was legal and thorough and final, and Mason never discussed it publicly and never would. The congressional hearing that ultimately convened 14 months after the night at the Iron Vulture's bar featured testimony from 9 witnesses, including a former OD auditor, 2 journalists, 3 federal investigators, and a retired school teacher from Billings, Montana named Evelyn Hartwell, who sat before a committee of United States senators and spoke for 47 minutes in the same clear, steady voice she had used in 31 years of classroom and in one biker bar in a snowstorm, and described in precise detail what her husband had discovered and what it had cost him and what she had done about it. The senators who asked her questions discovered, as Richard Vane had discovered, as the door had discovered, that Evelyn Hartwell was significantly more than she appeared to be. Yet, Caleb Marsh's mother received the full truth about her son's death on a Sunday afternoon in Missoula, delivered in person by Mason Turner, who sat with her for 3 hours and answered every question she asked and did not flinch from any of them. She cried. Mason sat with it. At the end, she asked him if her son had been brave, and Mason told her that her son had done the thing that people are most afraid to do. He had seen something wrong and had been trying to figure out how to make it right. And that was exactly what brave looked like in the real world, without a uniform, without backup, with nothing but a conscience and the belief that it mattered. Isa, she said, he always believed things mattered. Yes, ma'am, Mason said. He was right. Marcus Webb's family was contacted by Sarah Okafor, who spent 4 months investigating the deaths on Arthur's list and published a series that won every award available to it and was entered into the congressional record. 3 other families from the list received similar calls from journalists and investigators following the threads Arthur had laid down with 2 years of kitchen table work. Each of those families learned that the person they thought they'd lost to bad luck had in fact been paying attention to something real and had paid the highest price for paying attention and had not been forgotten. And Richard Vane was indicted on 14 counts. His legal team was excellent. He would fight it for years, but the files were real and the cross-referencing was meticulous. And Arthur Hartwell had been right. The documentation was airtight because Arthur had built it to be airtight, because Arthur had known from the beginning that it had to be something that could not be argued away or lost or buried, something so thoroughly and carefully constructed that the truth in it would survive him. And it had survived him. Every Sunday morning for the months and years after that November night, if you drove past the Iron Vulture's clubhouse in Garfield County, Montana, at the right hour you would see an old blonde woman sitting outside in a camp chair with a mug of coffee watching the highway. And at some point during that morning, various large men in leather would arrive, and each of them would greet her in a specific way that told you everything about what she meant to them, not with ceremony, not with formality, just with the easy warmth of people who have been through something real together and have decided without discussion that the connection made in that realness is permanent. They called her Mama Hart, not because anyone decided to, because someone said it once and it was exactly right and it stayed. And Evelyn Hartwell, who had been a school teacher and a wife and a widow and a woman running for her life and a woman sitting at a kitchen table for 14 months with her dead husband's encrypted files and the address of a biker bar, drank her coffee and watched the highway and received her Sunday morning hugs from enormous men who had once laughed at her in a doorway and now would not let the world touch her. And she was in the specific and permanent way that only the truth can make a person free. Arthur had been right about the facts being powerful. He had been right about the list. He had been right about the iron vultures. He had been right about Evelyn. He had been right about all of it, the meticulous, bifocaled, bad-need 5 a.m. coffee-making, little league coaching, newspaper reading man who looked like an accountant and turned out to be the most dangerous thing Richard Vane had ever encountered. A person who could not let a wrong number go uncorrected and who loved his wife enough to make sure that when he was gone, she knew exactly where to take it. That was Arthur Hartwell, and that was enough.